whole point of the book, Mark chapter 1, that Jesus is the Christ, he is the Son of God, and then Mark just kind of lays out, here's the evidence, here's the things that Jesus did, the things that Jesus said, that point to him being different than anybody else. We finished last class by looking at, after he had entered the city, we're in that final week now, and he'll be going back and forth day after day from Bethany and then back into the city in the morning, go back to Bethany at night, and repeat that over and over until the crucifixion. But when he originally enters in what we call the triumphal entry, there's this sense of pageantry and honor that he's worthy of, but really hasn't received up until this point. But it's very clear that he is of a different kind of character as far as kingship goes. He's this king of peace coming in on a donkey instead of a war horse. And he also acts as if he has authority. He doesn't tell everybody he has authority, he just acts like it. And one aspect of that was the fact that he entered the city, looked around, and then the next morning he comes in, makes a beeline for the temple, and overturns the tables, kicks out the money changers, drives all the people out who are using it as a place of market, as a marketplace, and then he's confronted in the very next set of events with, well, where do you get this authority? And Jesus addresses that. Chapter 11, he asks them about John the Baptist, and you realize that his opponents are just politicians. They don't actually have real authority. They're just politicians. In chapter 12, he lays out that parable of the vine grower, and makes it clear in that, clear enough to his enemies that they understand that it refers to them. And then on top of it, they ask him a variety of questions. He answers all of those questions very well. And then down in chapter 12, down about verse 35, he asks them a question and simply turns to them and says, here, I have a question about a verse. Here, David wrote this, and he said of his descendant, he calls his descendant Lord. How does that work? How can the son of David, also be David's Lord? And, of course, Jesus knows the answer to that, and we, through hindsight, know the answer to that, which is Jesus is both the descendant of David and also his God, his creator. But Jesus is using this as an opportunity that, like, you asked me a bunch of questions and I answered them all. Let me ask you one question and see if you can answer it. And it just reverses the tide of things. So he's been laying out this authority, again, not by saying I have authority, but just simply by showing it. He's showing himself to be the smartest guy in the room, the wisest guy in the room, the most powerful person in the room over and over and over again. And then down in chapter 12, we get down about verse 41. And it says, he sat down opposite the treasury and began observing how the people were putting money into the treasury. Now, before we go any further, I want you to connect this to what Jesus did in the triumphal entry. He comes into the city through the triumphal entry, enters in on a donkey, and what's he do that day? What's the one thing that Mark records that he does once he goes into the city? Remember? He goes and he looks around. He just looks around. Now, the next day, he does some things about what he saw. But he looks around and he surveys it like it's his place. In other words, this is my city, my temple. I'm going to treat it as such. Well, now, it's another day, but he's doing the same thing. He's here and he's opposite the treasury, and he's just observing and watching people as they put money into the treasury. Now, there are when you put that in the context of what's actually happening, imagine that I went and stood by the back black boxes and I just watched. And you all came up and I said, oh, could I look at that real quick before you? Okay. How long would it be before somebody had a problem with Scott standing by the black boxes, right? It would be one person. It would just take one person, right? The idea that somebody would have the audacity to monitor how much everybody is contributing to God, we find that troublesome. But that's exactly what he's doing. Now he's doing that though, and it tells you something about him. He has the right to monitor. He has the authority. It's his treasury. And so he's watching people put money in there. Now, if you really want to mess with your head, I want you to imagine it isn't me standing by the black box watching how much you put in and checking on the check. Jesus is, though. Right? When you put money and you contribute it to the work here at Eastland, I have no idea what you contribute or don't contribute. But the Lord knows exactly what you do. All right? So if you want to put it in modern terms that kind of messes with your head and makes you think about things a little bit, that would be one way for us to think about it. But the added piece is he's observing, and what's the first group that he observes? He's seen people put money in the treasury, and there's many what? Many rich people, and they're putting in large sums. And so he is aware of this. He's seeing the large amounts of money that they are putting in. And so he sees that, and then it says, a poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which amount to a cent. Some of your versions will say 2 mites, 2 half pennies. And so here, he's watching, and he's observing all of this going on. And again, this is odd, right? This is not the sort of thing that we would typically consider to be appropriate for somebody to do. And yet he's doing it. And then when the widow puts in her two mites, he said, truly I say to you, this poor widow put in more than all the contributors to the treasury. For they all put in out of their surplus, but she out of her poverty put in all she owned, all she had to live on. Now, here's the thing. There's several different elements in here. One, there is, as far as I can tell, a miracle that just happened in those verses. What's the miracle? We know what he sees, right? He sees people putting in the money into the treasury, putting in large sums, and then this widow comes with 2 mites. But then he says, where did they get the money from? The rich people, where did they get the money from? From their excess, from their surplus. How's he know that? Yeah, he's all-knowing. As far as I can tell, that's a miracle. And that she put in all that she owned. How does he know that? That's a miracle. See, that is supernatural knowledge. And we don't normally think about, oh, do you remember the miracle of the widow and her mites? But it is a miracle. So now, again, I'm tie it into today. You put money and you contribute to the work. Not only does the Lord know how much you put in, He knows what part of your budget it came from. And we don't talk about money a lot. And one of the reasons we don't talk about money a lot is because I, as a preacher, don't like talking about money a lot. I mean, I'll just be honest with you on that. I don't like talking about it because it makes me feel like a televangelist. I don't think it's the most important part of your spirituality, but I will say this, your money goes where your heart goes, doesn't it? And so you have to connect those 2 ideas at some point. And of all the things that Jesus observed that day, the one that got his attention was not the amount, but from where in the budget it came. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, oh, absolutely. He knows the intent. He knows the thought process behind it. He knows whether you have been intentional about it. Like 1 Corinthians 16 says that you're to do it in advance, right? It's a thoughtful process. You don't show up Sunday and go, what do I got in my pocket, right? And he also knows what part of the budget it comes from, what the intent of your heart is, what you have to give, what you don't have to give. All of that, he factors all of that stuff in. And so when we watch, we would just see large sums and then 2 mites. And interestingly, if you think about it, it would be much easier to see the large sums of money being put into the treasury because they don't have bills like we do now, right? And they didn't have checks. So if they put large sums of money in, it's yeah, it's going to make that nice sound, right? Whereas the widow, she puts her 2 mites in. Those things are just as tiny as can be. You know, archaeologists know how big those are. You can go online and buy some mites if you'd like. They find them all the time. And they're just as tiny could be. How close attention did our Lord have to be paying to notice the widow? Would have been easy to notice the large sum. But what he notices is the widow. Yep. Mm-hmm. Well, and it's not even just Jewish. That's just the world. That's the way it is. When you get to the book of James, James is going to talk about the same thing. You have a rich man comes in and a poor man comes in. Who do you naturally treat better? You're going to take care of the rich man. And he says that's partiality and that's not God. So, yeah, he's addressing, and you can take this all the way back to Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. On the Sermon on the Mount, he talks about the people who pray publicly, they fast publicly, they give publicly, and they have their reward in full. Pageantry to it. Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely a visible arena in which this is happening, that he can sit down somewhere in a public area and see it. And if he can observe it, again, back to the ka-ching, ka-ching, right? The large sums are easy to observe. And there's going to be that habit of people doing it to be seen, and then the other people doing it to be seen, and congratulating each other. All that sort of, it's just worldliness. For sure. I don't think it was surprising to the people around that he was in a position to observe. What I guess, whereas with us it would be, right? But it is the fact that he is doing it. like, it's in a public area, so anybody can observe if they want to. But he is making a specific point of, like, I'm just going to pay attention to who's putting in what. Yeah. It's it's a sacrifice for her. For all the rest of them, it's out of their excess, right? It it costs her everything to give. It costs them. Well, it's out of the surplus. It's out of the excess. It doesn't cost them anything that's going to affect how much food they eat, where they live, any of those things. This is just the extra money, and Jesus knows that. He knows the difference between the two. Okay, so then we move to chapter 13. So all of these events here in Mark, from chapter 11 forward, they center around the religious leadership, Jesus' interaction with them, and the temple itself. So he's been at the treasury, and now in chapter 13, as he was going out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Teacher, behold, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." And Jesus said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left upon another, which will not be torn down." Now, if you look at this model of the temple, this is Herod's building of the temple. That central building, you've got that large courtyard, but that central building there, that's the actual temple. That central area is where only Jews were allowed to go. It's where, when you read in Acts, they accused Paul of bringing a Gentile in and saying he was worthy of death. And it's that area that they come out of. So they come out of that, and as they're leaving that temple itself, not the Temple Mount per se, but the temple itself, they're just remarking on how amazing it is. And you can imagine, if you've been to any sort of impressive structure, like we have Capitol buildings and things like that are built out of marble and granite, and they're just impressive. They're very tall, just ornate. You can look at a building like that and just be impressed by the craftsmanship and the effort that was required to build it. That is what they're doing. And it did take Herod a very long time to construct all of this. And he did it as a gift to the Jews to try and get them to like him, and it didn't work. They still didn't like him. But they were just remarking how beautiful it is. And Jesus gives a shocking answer, which is, look, every single one of these stones is going to be torn down. In other words, you're caught up in how impressive it is. Actually, it's all going away. Now, the reference that he's making there is to the events of 70 A.D. In 70 A.D., Rome will come in and they will tear down that building. Those stones, that rubble, that is that temple. And if you look, in fact, I think I have a better picture here of it. So if you've got that road that's just caved in, and then that pile of rocks, and then on the other side of that, if you kept going, you would get to probably one of the more famous parts of Jerusalem nowadays, which is the Wailing Wall, which is where they go to lament over the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. Those stones are from the temple itself, and they were cast down off of the Temple Mount, and that's what broke in that road like that. Roman roads are not like American roads. They don't cave in that easy. So all of these things that Jesus talked about will eventually come to play. The Romans will do it. Josephus is one of our primary historical accounts of what happened with the Roman seizure of the city, is that there would be a fire. The gold on the temple itself would begin to melt. And the Roman soldiers, who they got their wages through the land that they were given at the end of their service, and then whenever they could plunder, started saying, let's get to this gold. And so they started tearing it down bit by rock by rock by rock to get to the gold that was melting between the cracks. And so they threw it over the edge. And today we just know this is a historical fact. This is what happened. Rome came in. They eventually seized the city after a long and protracted wait outside where there was famine and death and all sorts of horrible things. About 1.1 million people died in the seizing of Jerusalem. We know it as a fact, but it was a shocking idea at the time. I think so. Yeah. No, I think it... Yes, if you go down, let's see here, chapter 13, let's see, where is it? He's going to make that connection to... they're going to ask, and what I may be doing is Matthew, that's it. Matthew 24, so that's what I'm thinking. So Matthew 24, they're going to ask, what is the end? Yes. Yeah, and so in Matthew 24, we'll talk about the end. Mark doesn't spend the time on it. But yes, you're talking about the end of an age. In fact, I think I might have that verse even up on a later slide. Because yes, so what's happening is, so if you think about the temple is representative of the entire Old Covenant. How can you worship as a Jew without the temple? It's where you go to make sacrifices. It's where the high priest goes in to meet with God, right? Once a year for the Day of Atonement, to atone for your sins. You can't do that. It was also where they kept the genealogical records of who was of what tribe, which is kind of an issue because you need to know, if you were to try and rebuild the temple today, which they want to. Now, there's a lot of things that are in the way of that, one of them being that the Dome of the Rock, which is a Muslim holy site, is right where they want to build, and it would kind of cause a world war. But that's an issue. But when they start thinking about the different things that would be required to build a temple, there's this whole layer of different things. One of them, you're going to need a priesthood. Well, you need to know the genealogy. They don't. That genealogy gets burned up in that fire. You're going to have to be able to cleanse the temple using a red heifer. Red heifers are now extinct. So you can't, there's all sorts of money they've been putting into trying to rebreed red heifers without blemish. And so on, without a temple, Old Testament worship effectively cannot exist. Now, if you are a Jew today, you view it as the Babylonian era. Because during the era of Babylonian captivity, that was what they had, right? They had no temple. It had been wiped out. But what had God said when he wiped out the temple using Babylon? What was God's promise to the Jews at that time? You'll be back in 70 years. Yeah, so here you're going to go 70 years without, so you can learn what it's like to not have me. And I'm going to give you over to the idols. I'll give you over to the most idolatrous nation ever, and you can see the difference. And then after 70 years of time out, you can come back. But this time, Jesus is saying this is the end. No more. Because that Jewish era is over with. And so they will ask him once he leaves the city in verse 3, as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple. If you sit up on the Mount of Olives, you can look down through the Kidron Valley, and right there is the temple. Peter and James and John and Andrew were questioning him privately. Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when all these things are going to be fulfilled? Matthew 24 gives a much larger explanation of these events, so there will be a couple of times in the slides here that I'll mention that. But this is a shocking revelation that Jesus is saying. This is an interesting stone in and of itself. This is Trumpeter's Corner, and it was also one of the things that's been cast down. It was thrown down amongst all the rubble. The Trumpeter's Corner was a stone that was a corner where the trumpeter would go and blast the trumpets for each and every Sabbath. Sabbath starts, Sabbath ends. And any other sort of major Jewish feasts and festivals. And I bring that one up, one, because it's just kind of an interesting piece of history. But two, think of what that represents. Here you have the Jewish people, and there is no more call to Sabbath. There is no more call to the feasts and the festivals. This era is over. So, in Matthew 24, like I said, I'll reference some of the Matthew versions of this account because it's more detailed. They ask, tell us, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign of your coming, and of the, to reference what Terry pointed out, the end of the age. The end of the age that he's talking about there is not the end of the world, it's the end of the Jewish age. And so Jesus says, look, don't let anybody mislead you. Now, the reason he's concerned about them being misled is because if you are a Jew and you are being told by Jesus, look, Rome's going to come in and win. They're going to wipe you out. They will destroy Jerusalem and this temple. If you're a Jew, you say, no way. No way. We know that the Messiah is going to save us from Rome because we're looking for a certain kind of king, not give us over to Rome. We know that God will protect us. He always has in the past. And so Jesus, he's giving them a warning that he knows will easily be ignored by all the Jewish people and the early Christians, the Christians who exist in and around Jerusalem when this happens in 70 AD. They're going to be of that Jewish heritage too, right? So he'll tell them several things to watch out for. Beware of false saviors that will offer to help the nation, right? You're going to hear that there's a Christ that has come and he's going to save you. Nope, that's false. You're going to hear wars and rumors of wars. You're going to hear about all sorts of different things in the news. And no, that's not the end. You'll hear about famines. You'll hear about earthquakes. Those aren't the end. Now, why is he telling them all these things that aren't the end? Why might that be important for them to know the things that aren't the end? Because his whole point is there is an end. There is a point where eventually he's going to tell them, I want you to run out of Jerusalem and leave. Why is he telling them about all the things that aren't the end? That's just fine. Guesses are fine. Yeah, so don't be deceived by people who are false saviors, say, we'll save you from Rome, because that's not true. Yeah. So another is when this happens, you've got to keep preaching the gospel. This is not the end. This is the end of Judaism. It is not the end of Christianity. It's another element to it. Another aspect to things. We had a tornado warning just a couple of days ago, and it was at an odd time. Did anybody notice that? They had the tornadoes warning, sirens go off at an odd time. Well, it went off at an odd time, which made you think there's a tornado, right? Well, you look up in the news, and what's the news said? We're having a national test, and we're going to do it at this time. Why do they tell you it's only a test? Yeah, so when it goes off, they want you to know it's just a test, so that when it actually goes off, it's not the boy who cried wolf, right? Yeah. Yes. Yep. Yep. And so he's wanting them to be prepared for. Yep. Yeah. Well, and it is interesting because there are some parallels between these two. This is one of those things that's difficult because, in fact, in Matthew, the Matthew account, Matthew 24 deals with the destruction of Jerusalem, and then Matthew 25 deals with the end of time, and they do kind of parallel a little bit, right? And one of the things that is the risk with the destruction of Jerusalem is that they would be lulled into a sense of, oh, this isn't going to happen because we heard these wars and rumors of wars and then nothing happened. Well, in the same way, what do people say and what does Peter tell us will be said at the end as the end starts coming near? People are going to say what? Remember? Peter says one of the biggest mockings that they'll have is things are the same as they've always been. They just continue as they always have. And so it can lull people into a sense of security. Oh, it's so bad. Yes, and the Christians historically do leave. And get out. Yep, 100%. So, yeah, there are parallels to the end of time, but the biggest one is this Jerusalem will be destroyed, so you're going to see all these things. Even you're going to see saints being martyred. That's not the end of it. False prophets and teachings, that's not the end of it. The church, that initial fame of the church, that's going to wane. That's not the end of it. But then he'll say in Matthew 24, when you see the abomination of desolation, that's a connection to something a historical event that had happened previously, which is when you see the abomination of desolation was when a guy named Antiochus Epiphanes came into the temple to desecrate it and to sacrifice a pig on it and make the whole temple unclean. He said, when you see that, and that's why he says, when you see that thing, let the reader understand. In other words, you're seeing it again, you book it for the hills. You Christians flee to the mountains. You don't say, oh, God will save us this time. He's not going to. Get out. Because, as Scott pointed out, the savagery of what happens to them when Jerusalem is destroyed in 70 AD is massive. Will, did you have something? Mm-hmm. They all happen. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so all of these events are going to happen, but what you're looking for is that moment that you flee, that you run. Don't run until then, right? Keep preaching, keep sharing the gospel. Don't run until then. But when Rome shows up to desecrate the temple and they say, we're going to come in here and wipe you out, don't think, but God will save us, because have other nations tried to wipe out Jerusalem before? Yeah, and God saved them. So every Jew thinks, well, no, God will save us. No, God's not going to save you. You Christians flee for the mountains. Now, I mentioned Josephus says it was somewhere in the vicinity of 1 million or more people who died in Jerusalem when Rome laid siege to the city. They made a decision, the Romans did, to just surround the city. Ironically, they wanted to save the city and not destroy it. So they said, well, we'll just wait them out. Well, horrible things happen when you cut people off from food and water. So inside the walls of Jerusalem was just horrible, horrible things that occurred. And so the other thing, though, that history tells us is that it seems that the Christians took Jesus' advice, because in verse 14, he says, those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. And that's what the Christians did. And he makes it clear here, the one who is on the housetop must not go down or go in to get anything out of his house, and one who's in the field must not turn back to get his coat. So when you see Rome coming, how long do you wait to get out? You don't wait at all. You just go. Because, and here's what history tells us, when Rome surrounded the city, how many people did they let out then? None. No second chances. So you either get out before the army shows up and surrounds the city, or you don't get out at all. And history tells us the Christians did. They did flee to the mountains. They did survive because they understood what Jesus was saying. So as much as Matthew 24 is oftentimes associated and connected to the return of Jesus down the road, I think the context of Mark 13, the context of Matthew 24, is this physical event that was going to happen that he was preparing for. Now, we're not in a Matthew class, so I'm not going to deal with it, but I will tell you there is a pivot that happens between Matthew 24 and Matthew 25, where Jesus now begins to talk not about the fall of Jerusalem, but instead the end of time. And when we teach Matthew, we can cover that. But that if you're reading, I think there is a clear pivot there that happens. Mark tells everybody to flee, and so history tells us that the Christians obeyed Jesus. Now, in verse 24 and 25, we run into this language. In those days, after that tribulation. So the tribulation we're talking about is the destruction of Jerusalem and the falling of the temple. In those days, after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven. And the powers that are in the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. And then he will send forth the angels and will gather together his elect from the four winds, from the farthest end of the earth to the farthest end of heaven. Now, if you just read verse 24 through 26, does that not sound exactly like the second coming of Jesus? So your brain wants to jump to that. I am going to argue that that is not what that's talking about. That is not talking about the second coming of Jesus. That is talking about why the temple is being destroyed and Jerusalem is being wiped out. That language of the sun being darkened and the moon not giving its light and the stars falling from heaven and the powers in the heavens being shaken is Old Testament language that is used to refer to dark days of national judgment. We would say things like, it was a dark day in our history. The Jews say the sun was darkened and the moon didn't give its light. We would say, we're going to shake things up here, right? You have a change in government, and the new guy comes in, and he goes, we're going to shake things up here. What you know is he's going to change a lot of the powers and authorities. What Jesus is saying is, when you see Jerusalem destroyed, and the temple specifically, at the end of that tribulation, why did it happen? Why has God let it happen? Because it is the end of an age. because we're shaking things up and there is going to be a change of authority. You had an old covenant authority and following the law of Moses. Now what is it? Now you're going to be under the law of Christ. And God is going to gather his people, not from Jerusalem and Judea, but where are God's people going to come from? Everywhere, farthest ends of the earth. And I think it's beautiful that who's involved in the gathering process. The Gentiles are going to be wrapped up in that. Yeah, that's what's being referenced. And God says, who's he going to send to do that gathering? He's going to send his angels. That's talking about the era we're living in right now. There is angelic involvement in the goings-on of man to gather God's people together. And you can see that as you read through your Bible, that God uses angels to bring about his work, to bring his people together, all of those sorts of things. So I don't believe that set of verses is dealing with the end of time. I absolutely understand why it feels like it. But if we keep it in the context, I think it's dealing with the era that is coming because of the end of the Jewish era. Why is the Jewish era ending and the temple being destroyed? Because there's a coming of a new era, because God's shaking things up. Anybody have any comments or questions? Yes. Oh, he's back. Yeah, what's up? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, there was definitely a present distress of Christianity and its impact because Christianity was originally associated with Judaism, right? So Rome says, we're wiping out Judaism. And as they get tired of it, it's easy to connect Christianity to it. So part of that process was, as Judaism is being brought to its end, Christianity is kind of tied to it. And the Christians, I mean, like in the case of Jerusalem, there's Christians in Jerusalem, they have to flee. So that distress of that connection to religious persecution, I think it begins, 1 Corinthians 7 is before 70 AD, but those are all going to be connected, an era of birth pains, we might call it. So, right, yeah, hey, maybe wait till things settle down a little bit. Yeah, yep, that would be my understanding too. Yes? Yeah, it was also prophesied that Jesus would die on the cross. But they didn't get that one either. But you're right. The Old Testament said all of this stuff. I mean, this idea is not a New Testament idea. It's a Bible idea. So, absolutely. Okay. Yeah.